Welcome to Stats and Scheme. I am Sean Syed, joined as always by my good friend Tej Seth. We are a week and a half away from the draft, and we will, of course, have you covered. Thomas Dimitrov and Eric Eager and some guests. We'll be doing a live show before and during the first round of the draft. We'll have a bunch of other things that we will likely announce next week. Tej, you have been working on a bunch of graphics and data for the draft show. Are you excited for the draft, or are you more in the, let's just get it over with already camp?
I am excited for it. I think that the draft is a lot of fun, just because so many teams are involved in the actual draft night itself. You usually have at least 30 teams making a selection when the draft actually happens. So there's a lot of discourse around it. I think that you and I are going to have a lot of fun talking about it. Really going to bank on a lot of your insights for some of the players that I didn't get around to looking at their full profile for. Maybe I just looked at their data. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about those players as well, once the draft actually happens.
Yeah, I love that positivity. All 32 teams, it's the time to be optimistic until obviously late February or mid February when we talk about Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl. But today we're going to talk about general manager trends, in how they spend draft capital and what they may tell us about the 2024 NFL draft. As you wrote a really good article up on sumersports.com on the topic. What made you interested in exploring it?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of good research on from Browns fans on this particular topic, just because of what Andrew Berry does in the draft with some of his age guardrails, some of his positions. I think there's Jack Duffin, who's written about it. There's Cleve TA, another Twitter account who has put in a lot of work. So that kind of inspired me to look deeper into this. There's certain GMs that have different athleticism guardrails, they have age guardrails, they have positional investments that they like to make year over year. So I wanted to kind of look at all of these together as a holistic approach and kind of see, can we glean some information on what these teams are actually going to do in the first couple rounds of this year's draft based on what these active GMs have done in the past.
So we've both seen some of these graphs where it kind of takes like whatever time frame and then it gives like the value that the draft picks have produced for the team. And there is like a relatively small bandwidth where most general managers are falling into around like the same averages. So I guess I got the outset, Tej. Like, do general managers even like matter in the draft?
Well, I definitely think so. Obviously, there's going to be some owner influence and some influence from positional coaches on getting players that that they want from the draft. But I think when you look at whether general managers actually have influence over their picks, like there are tendencies from year to year. I talked about the Andrew Berry example earlier. Like he doesn't draft players that are over 22 years old, often at all, and that's the youngest average age among GMs when drafting. You have certain GMs like the Packers, who have been notorious for taking high athleticism players, usually on defense. And I think Brian Gutekunst has continued that trend. And then you have someone like Howie Roseman, who basically only invests in premium positions in the first couple rounds of the draft, mainly offensive line, defensive line. Sometimes you'll even take a receiver, but they're all positions that are paid very highly and have high average of the top 10 and 15 at that position. So I think all of those things combined, like you want to use that as well as like organization history and even just where the positional scarcity is. And when you look at all of that together, you can get a little bit of a better idea of what's going to happen in the draft.
Yeah, I like that. I think we're probably one step away from thinking, okay, like it makes sense that a specific general manager over a longer period of time has a trend. I mean, I of course think general managers matter. I want to think that all the all the players matter as well. It would be interesting to see when you do like the longer scale of, well, what value do those picks come to the team, like over maybe replacement or just going based on like grinding the Mox data or EDP and kind of seeing where GMs match up that way. For this article, what was your framework like when you were looking at value that general manager spent? Like, how did you determine like a value for draft capital allocation?
So I use the Fitzgerald Spielberger draft chart, which we talked about a couple shows ago, where I think the Jimmy Johnson chart is obviously used and like was developed for a reason and still used by these teams. But the Fitzgerald Spielberger chart done by Jason Fitzgerald and Brad Spielberger at Over the Cap and Grand Central Sports Agency, respectively, like it's more of an advanced way to look at draft capital and kind of like the true value among these picks. And when you talk about like general managers and their value, like you can look at how much surplus value is actually produced over expected, and there is some signal there. Like there are some GMs that are having a good process, like we talked about premium versus non-premium positions, or even some organizations that are better developing players over expectation. And the Fitzgerald Spielberg chart is a good way to kind of assess the prior of the pick, position agnostic, before you dive deeper into some of the details behind it.
So when you pitched the article to me, I think one of my initial issues, well, of course, there's going to be some first year general managers. Then there's going to be general managers that we don't have a ton of data on, or it can be like really player specific. And if you're at the top of the draft, you're probably selecting quarterback, like your allocation is going to look a little bit different. How do you think we deal with those? Do you think we just say, hey, we glean a little bit less information from those types of situations, or what's your kind of process there?
Right. I definitely think so. I think that's a great point to bring up because I do think it's a little bit bimodal in a sense where when you have GMs who have only done 2 to 3 drafts, we don't have that much data on them. And where they've allocated their positional draft capital, I think they're less likely to probably allocate it in this draft because they've already invested so much in it. Like I think about the Giants and how much they've invested in offensive linemen. That might make them less likely to do that in this year's draft just because the last 2 years have been so much offensive lineman investment. So they might want to go elsewhere. But then when you get longer into a GM's tenure, you think about the Brett Veaches, the Howie Rosemans, the Mickey Loomises, like those types of GMs, you have more signal in them just because they've spent like 60 to 90 picks on draft picks. And you have a lot of information about some of their tendencies and what they like to do in the draft.
Tation for the scheme part of the stats and scheme. So bimodal just means like on a distribution, it has like two peaks, right? Am I getting that one right?
Right. Yeah. There's 2 peaks, and they're kind of varying on like how much value we can get from that. I mean, you definitely know the stats stuff more than I know the scheme stuff, breaking out what actually bimodal means there.
Hey, yeah, college statistics was a good decision to take. All right, let's look at the top 10 first. Hey, which general manager do you want to look at first?
So I do want to start with Ryan Poles because he's someone who stood out to me with a couple things throughout this article. We know what he's doing at number one, but focusing on the number 9 pick, he doesn't seem to let age factor into his draft models or his kind of how he treats the draft. He has an average draft age of 22.9 overall and 22.2 in the first round, which is the first 2 rounds, which is on the higher side. So when I was looking at this, Rome Odunze is the oldest of the top 5 wide receivers. He's going to be 22 on draft night. So I think that while Rome Odunze has been a very popular mock to the Bears, this might make them more inclined to take him because they don't seem to only want like under 22-year-olds like other GMs do in the draft. So I think that might be interesting to watch if the Bears end up going with him, whether they trade up a little bit to get him or they hope and wait he falls to number 9.
So we're talking about just age a little bit earlier. In your mind, and we've talked about draft curves previously, like all things equal, if you have two exact, everything's the same except for age, you're going to choose a younger prospect every time, right? Just because, they may have more room to develop or literally more years to grow, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's the development factor on kind of like what you can do with him, and then it's also just kind of like you're hoping you get a player that can play their full career for your team, and like you're just tacking on years to the end of their career also when you take a younger player.
Yeah, and I imagine that a lot of the averages for these GMs are going to go up this year just because the like average age
Mhm.
of player is up because obviously the COVID years, all that kind of adds to these like you got like sixth and what feels like eighth year seniors sometimes. So that'll be kind of cool to look at. Who do you have next in the top 10?
So number 4 overall, the Cardinals, Monty Ossenfort. I think that when you look at only one draft last year, he traded back, from 3 to 12, and then he came back up from 12 to 16, sorry, to 6 to end up taking Paris Johnson. So I think we're going to see something very similar from him this year. The Cardinals already have the most draft capital in this draft, and he showed a tendency to want to take premium positions. Last year, he took an offensive tackle and an edge with his first 2 round picks. So I'm expecting something very similar from him this year, where he's probably going to trade back and then trade back up to get one of the top receivers and then use all the other draft capital they have on building up some of the other premium positions that the Cardinals have that they might not have, players that they necessarily feel great about right now. Like I think about cornerback, defensive tackle, and edge rusher all on the table for them when they have picks 27, 35, 66, 71. They have a lot of top 100 picks, and I like Ossenfort to really lean into that in this year's draft.
Yeah, the Cardinals have a real chance to morph their like next 4 to 5 years
Hmm.
because their defense really needs to be rebuilt in a lot of ways, just from a player like an infusion of talent. They're gonna have, as you said, so many picks. Is anything as cool as like the trade back and trade up in the draft? I feel like that's like the like fadeaway jumper, like over a 7 footer kind of in the draft. Obviously, we get that cool clip. I think the Cardinals ended up putting out. I'm not sure if they did or just NFL Films, but like you're on the phone with all the people at the same time, Tish. I mean, that's the coolest thing there is, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I do love the trade back and trade up, especially like the way he did it last year, where we know that teams probably over discount future picks when they're making trades. And he understood the Cardinals timeline relative to some of the other teams he was trading with. And he just accumulated a bunch of future picks where like now the Cardinals are kind of lapping the field in terms of draft capital this year. And he might even be able to just roll that over again when he does his initial trade back. Maybe he picks up a future second round pick and kind of gets that thrown in the trade at the last point because he knows whatever team is trading up for that quarterback might be a little bit desperate. Like I think he's going to work the phones like you mentioned we saw in that clip.
Yeah, part of the beauty of, if the Cardinals feel like, hey, we're going to go forward with Kyler Murray and you get that top pick, like there's just so much value there. And I think next week maybe we'll talk about like are the Patriots a team to trade back or kind of who do we expect really to trade back? But yeah, if someone wants to come up at 4, that's going to be a situation. And next week I know we got a bookmark like is it going to be more than 4.5 quarterbacks that go in
Mhm.
the first round? What GM do you want to talk about next stage?
So let's go to Rand Carthon here with the Titans at number 7 overall. Again, like only 6 picks last year, so pretty limited sample size on him. But I think when you kind of like put together the breadcrumbs on the Titans, he spent 44% of his draft capital on offensive line in last year's draft. They bring in like both of the Callahans, where we know there's going to be an emphasis on developing offensive line. Like I think a lot of signs point to the Titans taking an offensive tackle. I know that's been something that's also been commonly mocked, and I think once they kind of nail their offensive line, they really can start to work on some of the other areas of their roster. And they've already done that throughout the offseason. You sign Calvin Ridley, you trade for L'Jarius Sneed, and it's kind of all building up for them to really put the final touches on their offensive line.
Yeah, there are a few picks that it just feels like, well, this is what like a quote safe mock to make. And every time I feel like it gets to the Falcons, people usually mock Dallas Turner there. To the Titans, almost everyone's kind of throwing a tackle there. And it makes sense. I love that they got Calvin Ridley. You have a quarterback on a rookie deal. You're going to find out real quick, I think, hopefully, if that quarterback is going to sink or swim there. Now, Tage, you mentioned like a bet with your dad, or I think it was around Blake Corum, right? So obviously Brian Callahan has his dad, Bill Callahan, there, just like a legendary offensive line coach. I imagine has a little bit of his ear. Now, if your dad was telling you who to pick, what's your like? Do you weigh him? Do you weigh his thoughts there? How would you deal with that?
I mean, it would probably be a couple hours of debate, after he said who to pick, just because of some different viewpoints. But I'm sure at the end we'd converge and be like, all right, like we'll make this decision together. The ship is either going up or staying afloat as a group here, as a family.
Yeah, I'd love to see Joel fall to the Titans. I think that'd be fun. That'd be a good one for the Cowhands to get their hands. All right, let's move out of the top 10. Tage, I think the GM that like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, I think is just gotten so much attention for so many different reasons. I'm so excited to see what happens for the Vikings in this draft. Obviously, I think they got 11 and 23, if I remember correctly, and just a chance to is a quarterback going to fall to them? Are they going to have to move up for a quarterback? Like, what is going to happen there? What do you kind of have for some trends around Kwesi?
So yeah, Adolfo Menz has been really interesting with how he's treated the draft, right? Like it's among the 28 active GMs that we have data on, he's had the third highest average age among his draft picks. He's also had the lowest average athleticism. So, he doesn't seem to probably value age and athleticism like some other GMs do, which I think is going to be really interesting to follow in this year's draft. And I think that we've talked a lot about how the Vikings could potentially move up to number 4 and end up taking whatever quarterback is available to them. And I still think that's probably what's going to happen. But after looking at these trends, I do see a two-pronged approach from Kwesi here where he could move up to 4, but he also could be comfortable sitting at where he's at and either taking Michael Penix Jr. or Bo Nix, with the 11 or 23 picks because he hasn't shown that he really needs young players on his roster relative to the draft, like he might be comfortable having that experience instead, and valuing that instead when inputting a quarterback into this year's roster.
Yeah, I think that along the draft cycle, because it is fairly long, like we talk ourselves into, all right, well, this is going to happen. This is a possibility. This is a possibility. And so I think sometimes we assume, oh yeah, someone is going to trade up to 4 for JJ McCarthy. Just like I think, right? Wasn't it last year where everyone was like, yeah, Will Levis is going to go, whatever, at like pick 5 or something like that. So I guess we don't have to do too much of like, well, who was right and who was wrong. But I'm really, really interested to see like, well, the overall narratives of the draft. Like, is it like 6 quarterbacks in the first round, Tage? That just feels too high to me. Like, is someone really going to take Bo Nix at 12? I don't know. I guess we'll see. Tage, is it cool? I think let's talk about Howie Roseman next. I think he's at this point, this is going to be his 13th draft. So I was listening to the PHLY guys, Zach Berman and Bo Wolf, who just do a really, really good job. They've been beat reporters there for a really long time. So Howie's had 12 drafts. I think it's only 1 first round cornerback. And they were kind of talking about, a little bit of that is how just boards have fallen. So the year they take Devontae Smith, who just got a nice extension, I think it was Surtain and Horn, who they felt, if they were still on the board, they probably would have gone cornerback there. I think of Howie Roseman's 13 first rounders, only 4 of them are underclassmen, 9 of them are seniors. So that can kind of go maybe a little bit into age there. And let's talk about Devontae Smith. Like, what a good job by Howie Roseman, aside from just the trends of draft capital, to consistently sign the homegrown talent early. I think that is such a big deal, where it feels like maybe even another team in the division is now coming up to the problem of, well, this is what happens if you wait too late. And there is a gamble to signing players early, like they have. I think Carson Wentz got signed pretty early, and you have to deal with the problems of that. You get bailed out in a lot of ways by having Jalen Hurts have the success that he had. But if you're signing those players early, you're probably going to keep them, like, in a year or two, they're immediately going to not be at the top of the market anymore. And then if you're going to assume that the draft or the salary cap is going to continue to rise, it's a little bit of free money, Tage. We talk about the statistics, the economics, like you're really kind of borrowing against nothing there, because the rates are rising up there. And obviously whatever the locker room kind of things are going on there. But Tage, do you have any thoughts on that Devontae Smith signing or re-signing extension?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point to bring up. Like, I think it's a combination of a couple things. It's like you mentioned, getting ahead of the market. There's so many receivers that are about to be extended this offseason. So it's like when the Eagles are the first one to kind of do it, they can get more of a team-friendly deal with respect to the deal that they gave him. I think we even saw that last year. They were the first ones to go out and re-sign Jalen Hurts. Then you have this cascading effect where all the 3 other quarterbacks that had to be extended or given a new contract last year just had a little bit higher than Jalen Hurts in terms of APY that got put on top of that. So I think like that's an advantage to do that. It also gives you more flexibility. Like Eric and I talked about this on the Friday show. Like, you can prorate their signing bonus over more years when you extend them a year early. You can also do more stuff with your own franchise tag, because it doesn't have to get held up in this specific player that you're kind of waiting on whether that you can extend them or not. Like, you can have the franchise tag leverage. I think the Giants ran into this a couple years ago with Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones. Only 1 franchise tag, 2 players that kind of fit the franchise tag mold, and so they had to extend one of them. They had to franchise tag the other, and it might have not exactly aligned with their team plans. I think the Jaguars have also been a team that kind of saw this year with Calvin Ridley and Josh Allen both being potential candidates for that, but like not really knowing kind of how to handle it, because you had the 2 players on that. So I liked all of like kind of what the Eagles did from a proactive standpoint. I think Brad Spielberg, again, going back to him, like pointed out a good point on Twitter, like these are decisions like the Carson Wentz going really well or going really poorly, or some of the other ones going really well, that kind of just increase your range of outcomes. And it increases the chance you end up going 4-13, but it also increases the chance you end up going 13-4, right? So it's like you're kind of going for the Super Bowl instead of just going for 8 or 9 wins.
Yeah, Tage, it's the guys like us speaking into microphones. We obviously are always going to root for teams to swing for the fences. And at this point, the Eagles have so many players on the offensive end that are in whatever, like the top 5, top 8 of APY. So you hope that through this draft, they hit on some defensive picks. Of course, they add some free agents, but and you hope that some of those age curves maybe look a little bit prettier in Philadelphia than elsewhere. Tage, who do you want to hit on next?
So yeah, let's talk about Howie Roseman a little bit, just from a draft standpoint. Just because when you look at how he's allocated his draft capital, he has put 8.5% of it on quarterbacks, which is pretty high. Relative to other GMs, like you talked about, obviously drafting Carson Wentz high, but like kind of thinking ahead and drafting Jalen Hurts in the second round. And I don't think he'll draft a quarterback this year. I guess they did with Tanner McKee last year. So it's like he's been good about that, but like he's also been above average on offensive line and defensive line draft capital spending, while being below average at positions like running back and linebacker. And wide receiver has also been one he's been about league average on, with 12.5% of his draft capital there. So it's like I don't, and draft kind of lines up with this too, but like I don't think that the Eagles with Howie Roseman and like even their roster holes, like there's definitely a higher chance they take one of the offensive defensive lines, or maybe even a wide receiver in the first two rounds, instead of it being a lock that they're going to take cornerback. I think they're a team that likes to follow what's worked for them in the past, and they feel good about their projections. And so first round corners have a higher variance to their outcomes than the offensive defensive lines, and maybe even wide receiver. So I think like any GM that had the Eagles roster, you could probably pencil in defensive back for them. But I think for Howie Roseman, it's less likely. Obviously, still could happen.
The Eagle situation is always fun to look at because obviously Howie Roseman has had a long time there, but it's a stable situation there, and it feels like they gain some edges just because of that, where there's very clear owner support, so they can manipulate things that way. And Howie Roseman, it seems like, can make decisions with just like a longer time horizon, as opposed to being like, okay, if we don't make the playoffs this year, like I am done, and kind of making our decisions kind of from that situation. So that's big. I think the Madden version would be like Brian Thomas falls to the Eagles, and they just go full on, go crazy there. Obviously, I think developmental offensive line, or maybe not just a developmental offensive line, someone that you can, like a bigger guy plug in at guard that is able to kind of bump out to tackle when Lane Johnson gets out there. That feels like some of the Eagles would do. Of course, we'll be able to see. And Tish, I feel like recently they've been more than happy to kind of trade up just like a few spots within the first round. And the PHLY guys who I mentioned earlier, they were given a story, I think it was 2014, where Howie Roseman's sitting there. He's 7 spots away. There's 6 players on the board they have, and he says, no, we can be patient. We can be patient. All 6 of those guys go off, and then they kind of trade back from maybe a spot of a little bit less power. So it feels
Mhm.
like they're a team who, and I have to imagine most teams do this, where you're really tiering it and saying, okay, we feel the run of players that is happening right now. If we don't get one of these 3 players, we pretty much need to get out of here. So let's trade up at this time. And then I don't know, if Howie picks up the phone and you're on the other side of it, like, why are you taking that call? Put the phone down. It feels like he's gonna win that deal every time.
No, that's a good point. Like there has been that little bit of a tendency. Like you can even look at last year's draft when they traded up the one spot to take Jalen Carter, but also like they traded away a future third last year to make sure that they could take Kelly Ringo. In the fourth round. I think it might have been like the first pick of the fourth round. So it's like they do want to end up with their guys, and I think that's like something that they're gonna do. But yeah, it's all about kind of the developmental side of things, like you said, and having Jeff Stoutland and knowing that you can give him an offensive lineman in the second or third round that might have traits, but maybe not the production or the polish, and kind of have him work with that offensive lineman so that he's ready once you kind of cycle over your offensive line 1 to 2 years down from now.
Yeah, I mean, if the Eagles keep on being University of Georgia North and like somehow end up with Brock Bowers, we're gonna have to. Our good friend Shil Kapadia, he's gonna be sweating. We'll have to talk to him about that. Tish, why don't we stay in the division? What do you have kind of Will McClay and the Cowboys?
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to separate what the Cowboys have done, between Jerry Jones, his son, Will McClay. So I was kind of just looking into like when Will McClay took over the Cowboys drafts, because they have been really good since Will McClay has had a big role in that draft. So I kind of wanted to capture his trend in particular. I think it was since 2017 is when he started. What I found is they've been really big on taking highly athletic players in the first 2 rounds, and then they don't really care for athleticism much after that, which I thought was interesting. Micah Parsons didn't have a combine, but we still have his pro day numbers. He had a 9.8 RAS score And then we have our own predictive athleticism score. They've taken Chidobe Awuzie, who is a 96, Tyler Smith, 95, Mozzie Smith, 92, Taco Charlton, Luke Schoonmaker, like very highly athletic guys they've spent first or second round picks on. CeeDee Lamb was like kind of an exception to the rule here. Obviously, that's worked out really well to them. But when looking at players that the Cowboys might potentially take, like I think offensive tackle has been a position that's mocked to them. Like I think it's good for them that a lot of these offensive tackles that might be in their range, like Amarius Mims or Tyler Guyton, like did well at the combine. They ended up with pretty good athleticism scores, and it might make them feel better about drafting one of those guys.
Tej, let's talk about the real situation in Dallas. Okay, so we got CeeDee Lamb, Dak, and Micah Parsons. First thing, I want you to kind of rank from the three, from most likely to least likely. Like, this is a player that 100% will be on the team. This is a player that is less likely, and this is a player that is less likely to be on the team maybe over the next 2 years. So who's like your most likely of the three? Like, you feel really solid. This of the three players is going to continue to be a Cowboy into the future.
This is a great question. I feel like it's pretty confidently Parsons, right?
Yeah, I think so, right? There's just like no way that they that they can allow Michael Parsons to get out of there. And then what about from Dak and CD? Who would you have on next there?
So I think CD would probably be the second most likely to be on the Cowboys past this season.
Okay, so no, I didn't say so. It could technically be 199, 98 for you. You're just ranking within the three. But that, so you're saying that Dak would be the least likely of the three to still be there.
Yeah, I think so, just because they have been weird with like kind of his situation, right? Like I thought kind of extending him before free agency was something that seemed like they should do, just because it would allow you to open up a little bit more in free agency. And like I think Dak obviously and his agent did a really good job the first time negotiating with the Cowboys, getting him a shorter deal so he could come up again like he's about to do after this season. So maybe the Cowboys are still a little bit salty about that and might want to move on from him eventually.
You think Dak should just try and take another 3-year deal, get as much guaranteed, and just like continue to bump up against the Kirk Cousins business school study?
That's what I was about to say, right? That's what Kirk Cousins has taught everyone, is like, get these short, if you're the player, get these shorter deals. And even if you're older and coming off a torn Achilles, you're still going to get a lot of guaranteed money in free agency if you're available, if you're a pretty good quarterback.
Yeah, and Dak has an interesting story. He was also, right, he wasn't a high pick, just like Kirk Cousins wasn't. Dak had that awful ankle injury, just like Kirk Cousins has had his injuries too. So maybe it's getting a little bit too connected over there. Quasi, I don't know. Is he going to pick up the phone and then talk to Dallas? We'll see. Okay, so CeeDee Lamb, like, if you're another team that needs a WR1, you're going to try? I would try, right? At least pick up the phone. I'm not sure if you would get a call back, but I mean, that's another play. Like, I keep thinking, all right, well, if whatever Brandon Ayuk is thinking, call San Francisco and see if you can do something to get him out of there. I feel like CeeDee Lamb you can kind of think of similarly, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Ayuk are at least in the same tier, if not Lamb is like slightly higher. Is that kind of what you think?
Ooh, that's tough. This is like a styles make fights kind of thing. Well, we'll just call them both WR1s. I think I'm
Yeah,
comfortable
that's
saying
fair.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I keep thinking about like CeeDee Lamb with Kellen Moore because like being used in the slot, and we talked about Devontae Smith earlier. Tage, I think this is my second or third time saying it on this podcast. I can't wait till we get to division previews in June and July and talk about maybe July and August if I'm remembering my months correctly. Just Devontae Smith and the CeeDee Lamb role is going to be a lot of fun, but that has nothing to do with the Cowboys. Tage, let's continue forward. Who's the next GM that you want to talk about?
So let's talk about Brad Holmes here for the Lions at number 29 overall. Something I actually want to ask you about is, do you think Brad Holmes is less likely to trade out of round one just because the draft is in Detroit?
Darius, that is absurd. Well, I love this. Love this thought. No, I don't. I don't think that is. But I have a counter question. Tage, how long would it take you to dunk on the media? Like, I think we're very comfortable and open saying, we didn't love the first round pick from Brad Holmes last year, and so he makes the decision. I think they hit a really home run at least in year one. Decides to do the dunk right after year one. How many years would you wait for your chance to dunk on the media?
I feel like
Would you think like after the first touchdown Like, would you just be like, I'm going guns blazing? Or are you more of a long-term guy there?
I feel like I'm the opposite just because like I'm so worried about some random Twitter account with 150 followers and like no profile picture making like a cut up of like me saying these different quotes and then it like backfiring on me actually on the field. So it's like I would wait a long time to end up dunking on the media just because of that. But where do you
Yeah,
stand there?
I can't. No dunks, Dave. No dunks. Only layups over here. Yeah, no, I can't wait. I think we are gonna end up doing a lot of fun stuff around the draft. And maybe I'll make sure that I'm the cut up guy. For next year when a player just like turns out, oh, they didn't work, so we can do maybe an internal dunking instead of two X and I. What do you got for Brad Holmes?
So Brad Holmes has invested a lot of draft capital in defensive line, but I even think he might have to dip into that well this year. Again, 31.2% of his draft capital has been defensive line related. Levi Ozarinke, Aleem McNeil, Aiden Hutchinson, Josh Pascal. Two of those guys worked out. Two of those guys didn't work out. You sign DJ Reader, who's 30 and coming off a leg injury. You sign Marcus Davenport, who hasn't been super productive lately, but like, there's some depth there. I think that edge 2 and defensive tackle 2.5 is like both on his mind. And I think that either at pick 29 or maybe on day 2, like defensive line is definitely going to be something Brad Holmes invests in because the need is there. And he's had a strong tendency to invest draft capital in that position group over his couple years as Lions GM.
Yeah, I think last year we talked a little bit, or I guess a lot of it, about whatever was going on with Lions cornerbacks. I would love for them to invest up front. I think that would be good. I wonder, is it maybe a situation where he trades up in round one? I think I know Eric Eagle put out a really good article on teams kind of trading from that back portion of the first round and end up trading up, and sometimes the results of those picks are a little bit better, just because if you're like the Lions at 29, you had a really good record the last year. You're probably a little bit better of a team than some of those teams that are a little bit early in the draft. So trading up as a later team can have some extra value just because, there's a chance that you're able to do more with that pick. So I wonder, if the Lions seem like hey, these are our guys. We're gonna go ahead and get them. Kind of, I forgot it was called Path to Draft or something on the Lions social media last year. It was really, really fun to watch on their YouTube channel. I'm sure they'll do something great again. And I know you'll be watching all of it. Tej, who do you got next?
So sticking with defensive line, John Schneider for the Seahawks, I think is going to be really interesting. Like he's another guy we have a large sample for. He's invested 27.4% of his draft capital on defensive line, which is above the league average of 23%. But when you break that down from a granular level, he's actually invested 20.2% of his draft capital on edge and only 7.2% of it on interior defensive line. So he's preferred to invest in edge over defensive tackle in the past. I think there might be some signal there in what the Seahawks are going to do in the first or second round. We know Mike McDonald is going to want to have some pretty good defensive line talent in Seattle, like he did in Baltimore, and even going back to his Michigan days. And so before I was like pretty dead set on the Seahawks taking someone like Byron Murphy and really just getting a defensive tackle there. But after looking more into his trends, I'm thinking that there's a higher chance they take edge than I probably previously realized.
Yeah, we had talked about it earlier, and it felt like when you were leading defensive tackle, I was just dreaming like, let's get Laitu Latu to fall. If you would consider that a fall to Seattle, that would be fun. It's great that I felt like McDonald always did such a good job, particularly last year. You get the most out of that whole entire rush unit, and it feels like he does want to drop out defensive ends a little bit. So it's not just, hey, we got 4, go chase the quarterback, and this will be their first year without Pete Carroll there, whatever. I'm not sure. We never heard anything about there was like real conflict with Schneider there making decisions, but it's really fully Schneider now, obviously with, the head coach. And Tage, I mean, speaking of no dunks, the Pete Carroll basketball hoops out of the media room. So that is an important thing. What else you got there?
Just one other point I wanted to add was like, I think, Jalen Carter was like so commonly mocked to Seattle last year. And like, obviously there was off-field stuff that could warrant passing on him, but like the Eagles Eagles a very high-end organization that believes that they can keep players in check. Like they ended up taking him. Like the Seahawks invested in cornerback at that position. So it's like, yeah, maybe they want to get defensive tackles in free agency or the trade like they made last year. Like maybe that's kind of their strategy for interior defensive linemen, and then edge is really where they want to invest in the draft.
Yeah, I can't wait to see Devin Witherspoon in the Mike McDonald defense. Why don't we finish off kind of on the inspiration for this podcast on Andrew Berry and the Browns?
Yeah, so I had to get Andrew Berry here. Our Leonardo DiCaprio when it comes to the draft. The by far the lowest average age of any GM in football. He's only spent 3 draft picks his entire tenure as Browns GM on players over 23 years old. So 3 of his 31 draft picks have been on players over 23 years old. The rest have been 23 and under. And usually early in the draft, he tries to go 22 and under. So he really tries to go into the development there. Browns obviously don't have a first round pick, so I'm talking about pick 54 here. He's invested not only in younger players, but also in a lot in positions that like you quote can't have enough of. And so like what I mean by these positions is like you'll often hear people, especially during the season when we really get into peak injury time, like you can't have enough edge rushers, you can't have enough defensive backs, offensive linemen, and you could even throw wide receivers in there. Like you can't really have enough of those positions because there's multiple of them on the field at the same time, and depth is often something that is like harder to come by, especially for offensive line. So I think when you look at how he's invested his draft capital, 28% in defensive line, 21% in defensive back, and 20% in offensive line. Like I think those could all be on the table on day 2 for him as well, just because of that. And then I'm expecting those players to be at least under 23 years old, but maybe even younger as well.
I like that framing of the positions you can't get enough of. I think defensive line particularly is such a good example. Like you think of Cleveland, like they are the 4 down.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go ahead and just let's go really, really after the quarterback and send them straight up the field and go have some fun. I wonder with age, and we talked about a little bit earlier, obviously the COVID years, like the age average is just going to be up this year. Do you think it's just something this year where you throw it out the window a little bit if you were the GM, or how do you think you'd approach that?
Right. No, I'm glad you brought this up because that was something I was thinking about over the weekend was like, yeah, it is the COVID year. I think you can't throw it out the window completely. I still think guardrails will be in place for a lot of these GMs when it comes to age. I know that's something that we've discussed internally a lot as well. As like, yeah, we like this player, but he's 23 years old. I think like Ricky Pearsall is a really good example of that from our draft guide. Where like data wise, he shows up really well, but he's a little bit older. So like kind of how you deal with that. You look at the NBA draft and like how important age is for them, and like kind of seeing how they've been able to handle that with COVID because they've been a year or 2 ahead with like the age that players can come out there, and like age is still seem like it's been a factor in their draft pick. So it's definitely lesser of a factor in this year's draft than previous, just because of the COVID year, players having to transfer, players maybe taking a redshirt year because of that. So I am glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, I wonder what over the longer term with the transfer portal is so much more wide open, and then teams are players gonna maybe they say, hey, I had a decent sophomore year, like I can go somewhere else my junior goes down, I can go somewhere else and have a big senior year and be able to take your stock just up. Overall, maybe I don't know if you have some like takeaways that obviously I think we both understand and acknowledge these things are so context dependent, and of course certain teams aren't going to have 15 seasons of data for you to be able to take with one GM. I guess, do you think like you would have some trends based on this information or things that you feel like, hey, this is a positive trend? If I was GM, this is maybe a trend that I would want to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one is probably the premium position investment. We've talked about this on a couple different shows, and like don't always want to boil down a player to a singular number, but just from like when you look at contracts and like what the league going rate is for positions, like investing in positions that are higher paid, if they are available to you, I think is the big one. But I think I would be someone who definitely wants to get younger players earlier in the draft, like rounds 1 to 2. I'd try to be focusing on players that were at least younger than 23 and maybe younger than 22. And then later in the draft is like where I'd kind of ignore the age more and take highly athletic players, just because like you're kind of banking on the traits there, like players that showed up really high in predictive athleticism scores. Like I think Chris Ballard has done that a lot. Brian Gutekunst has done that also. Mickey Loomis, Eric DeCosta, Jason Light, like Brett Veach, like those are all examples of GMs who've taken higher athletic players later in the draft. And I think that's also something I would lean into as well.
Okay, so you're telling me that you would have a bimodal distribution for age over rounds? Is that what you're trying to tell me here?
Yeah, it probably would be bimodal distribution.
There you go. I do think that overall it feels like that. I don't know, maybe I'm optimistic. I think every year that it feels like teams get just like a little bit sharper, or maybe there's just more, public information out there, and then that's reflected kind of in the decisions that are kind of made in private. So I like to think that over time, these teams continue to make it, and at the same time, Tish, obviously we still get limited information. Like whatever film I watch on a prospect, I do not have the medical checks. I do not have like whatever like psyche evals or that level of things that teams are doing with these players. So it always feels like guessing it in so many ways. Ted, do you have any thoughts on an important question that you posed to me? So it feels like, Tej, we're doing, I think, a decent job on the podcast. Eric Eager, always sending his support, and I think our numbers are doing well. So it feels like, I'm a proponent of no one or maybe you can make your own nickname. Maybe you shouldn't make your own nickname. But for our fans, Tej, the loyal listeners of Stats and Schemes, we gotta have some sort of name, maybe even just for when we text each other, when we refer to like the ideal person that is listening to this absurd podcast. So I had some thoughts. Of course, there's no bad ideas in a brainstorm. Tej, I wanted to combine stats and schemes. So I came up with Statschis. Like, look at all of these Statschis. So it's like it has the stat in it. It has the ski part of the scheme. And Tej, what is your eval for me on that?
I actually think it's a great name. I had to pose the question for you. I wasn't going to come up with it myself. Like you're far more creative than I am. And Statskis sounds like it should be the name of our fans, but maybe we do also pose this on Twitter, and kind of see what the Statskis temporary name for now say that they should be called. Because I think it'd be interesting to see some of the responses. And I mean, I think I got this idea because I'm like, Ben Brown, who works here with us at Sumer, and also our friend Dave Salfaro, we're all in like this group chat, and Dave was sending a clip of a podcast I never heard of before called the Giggly Squad, and they were talking about like how winning the Super Bowl is like an ick if you're looking at any of the players, and so Ben Brown ended up going off and like listening to a couple of their shows, and he's like, they're really funny, like you should check them out. So I'm like, okay, I'll listen to an episode. And they called their fans like the Gigglers. I'm like, oh, that's such a cool name. Like that ties back to the podcast. I'm like, we need our own name now. So Statskis is a good one to start with. And we'll kind of see what the wisdom of the crowds says on that.
It is. You never fail to entertain me. How would we spell it? Would it be like STAT like dash SCES? Like how are we doing it? Just like STATSKIS, or what are you feeling on our initial? And also, Tej, before you even do that, I like saying like name pending, or like, it's the temporary name. It's we'll do the podcast for 15 years, but it'll still just be a temporary name.
That would be great. Yeah, I think we should do STATSCHIS, right? Because like at least you get the beginning of the scheme there. I felt like a kid at the spelling bee, like trying to write that out in my head when I was doing that.
Yeah, we're gonna get a bunch of Scrabble points. All right, Tej, we gotta get out of here. Thank you to everyone for spending some of your time with us today. Visit sumersports.com. Follow us on Twitter and YouTube at Sumer Sports. Don't forget to leave a nice rating wherever you choose to be. Most importantly, enjoy the rest of your week, and we will see you next time.